A strange glow in the wilderness. Jack Travers gripped the steering wheel tighter as his car jostled along the rocky path. The winding mountain road wasn't just rough. It seemed determined to rattle his last nerve. For years, his cabin nestled deep in Cedar Hollow had been a distant memory, an untouched sanctuary amid the chaos of his life. But the burnout of endless workdays and a nagging feeling that he was losing himself had finally driven him back here, seeking peace. The cabin came into view at last, its familiar outline a shadow against the darkening sky. Jack sighed, relieved, but his breath caught when he noticed something odd. A soft, pulsating glow leaked from the windows, painting the snow-covered ground in eerie, shifting colors. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, slowing his car to a stop. The cabin was supposed to be empty. He hadn't told anyone he was coming, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. His logical brain suggested a power surge or some kids pulling a prank, but deep down, something about the scene didn't feel right. Grabbing a flashlight, Jack stepped out of his car. The cold mountain air hit him like a slap, but he barely noticed. The glow seemed alive, pulsing and moving, as though the cabin itself were breathing. A shadow moves. Jack crept closer, heart pounding. Peeking through a narrow gap in the curtains, he froze. Inside, the cabin was no longer the cozy retreat he remembered. Strange translucent panels hovered midair, displaying shifting, unreadable symbols. Floating orbs emitted the glowing light, casting surreal patterns across the walls. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the window. Jack recoiled, stumbling back. His foot snapped a twig, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the still night. The shadow paused, and then, to Jack's disbelief, the front door creaked open. The alien woman appears. Standing in the doorway was a figure unlike anything Jack had ever seen. She, or it, was tall and impossibly graceful. Her skin shimmered like liquid silver, reflecting the light in waves. Her eyes, large and glowing gold, locked onto him with an intensity that rooted him to the spot. Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this real? A dream? Some kind of elaborate hoax? The figure tilted her head, her expression unreadable. I live here," Jack stammered, his voice shaking. The alien woman stepped back, disappearing inside, and slamming the door shut. A bold decision. Jack stood frozen, his breath fogging in the cold night air. Every rational part of him screamed to get back in his car and drive away. But curiosity clawed at him, outweighing his fear. Who, or what, was this creature? And why was she in his cabin? Swallowing his apprehension, Jack stepped onto the porch. The faint hum that had filled the air grew louder, resonating in his chest. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Inside, the glow was overwhelming. Alien technology filled the space, floating panels, shifting holograms, and strange, pulsing devices that hummed softly. In the center of it all, the alien woman stood with her back to him, working on a console that seemed to hover in midair. An uneasy alliance. The woman turned, her golden eyes narrowing. Jack raised his hands, palms out. "Oh, hi. I don't mean to intrude. In my own house, I guess. But could you explain what's going on here?" She tilted her head again, then reached into a small pouch at her side. Pulling out a sleek device, she pressed a button. A burst of static filled the air, followed by a robotic voice. "Leave. Dangerous." Jack frowned. Dangerous? What's dangerous? The woman pointed to herself, then to the glowing device in the corner, and finally back at Jack. "Oh, great," Jack muttered. "So you're dangerous. Fantastic. Look, I don't want any trouble. Can we just—" Before he could finish, the woman gestured sharply, and the floating panels rearranged themselves. A holographic display appeared, showing a sleek alien ship with multiple red markers indicating damage. "The hunt begins." Jack stared at the display, realization dawning. "You crashed here?" he asked. The woman nodded, then tapped the device again. Hunters. Coming. Jack's stomach sank. Hunters. As in, more aliens. Dangerous ones. She nodded solemnly, her golden eyes scanning him with an expression he couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Regret? Jack rubbed his temples. Okay, so let me get this straight. You're on the run from some kind of alien bounty hunters, and you've turned my cabin into your hideout. The woman gave a single, sharp nod. Great, Jack muttered. Just great. Well, if we're going to survive this, you're going to have to let me help. Deal? The woman hesitated, then slowly extended her hand. Jack shook it, feeling a faint electric buzz where her shimmering skin met his. Okay, he said, exhaling deeply. Let's figure out how to not die. The unlikely team. Jack had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was unlike anything he'd ever faced. The alien woman, Lyra, as the translator device later revealed her name, was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her every movement was precise, her glowing golden eyes scanning everything with an unrelenting focus. Jack watched as she darted between the holographic panels floating in midair, her shimmering silver skin reflecting the pulsating glow of the technology around them. He felt like an intruder in his own cabin, though that was the least of his worries now. Lyra barely acknowledged his presence at first, fully absorbed in her work. Jack, however, couldn't stop pacing. His cabin was unrecognizable, transformed into what could only be described as an alien tech lab. Devices hummed and glowed in ways that made his skin tingle, and the air smelled faintly of something metallic and sharp. Every few minutes, he opened his mouth to ask a question but stopped himself, unsure if he wanted to hear the answers. Finally, he couldn't hold it in any longer. So, Lyra, he said, trying to sound casual, how long do we have before your hunters show up? Lyra paused, her glowing eyes meeting his. She tapped on her translator device, and the robotic voice answered, soon. Searching. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Great, just great. And what happens when they find us? Lyra pointed to the glowing device in the corner of the room. The translator responded, stabilizer. Incomplete. Jack frowned. And if you don't finish it in time? The translator hesitated for a moment before replying, destroyed. Jack let out a long breath and sank into his recliner. No pressure, then. The tension in the room was thick as Lyra returned to her work, her hands moving with inhuman speed over the controls. Jack watched her for a moment, marveling at the fluidity of her movements. Despite the absurdity of the situation, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. She was clearly desperate, running for her life, and now she was stuck with him, a guy who could barely fix his own coffee maker, let alone help repair alien technology. Jack stood up, determination replacing his fear. All right, he said, clapping his hands together. What can I do to help? Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she pointed to a small compartment that had been installed where his fireplace used to be. Inside were various alien tools and parts, glowing faintly in the dim light. Jack hesitated, then reached for a strange-looking wrench-like device. This? He asked. Lyra nodded and gestured for him to follow her. She pointed to one of the floating panels, which displayed a series of symbols that Jack couldn't begin to understand. She tapped on the translator, and it responded, connect, stabilize. Jack squinted at the panel, then at the tool in his hand. Right. Connect and stabilize. Easy. It wasn't easy. The device hummed and vibrated in his hand, almost as if it were alive. Jack fumbled with it, trying to mimic Lyra's precise movements. She watched him with a mixture of impatience and something that almost looked like amusement. Hey, Jack said, glaring at her, I didn't exactly take a course in alien mechanics, okay? Cut me some slack. Lyra sighed, a sound that the translator didn't bother interpreting, and stepped closer. She took the tool from his hand, her fingers brushing against his for a moment. Her touch was cool and electric, sending a shiver down his spine. She demonstrated the motion again, slower this time, and then handed the tool back to him. Jack tried again, and this time, the panel emitted a soft chime. Lyra nodded in approval, and Jack couldn't help but feel a small surge of pride. They worked side by side for hours, Jack following Lyra's instructions as best he could. Despite their differences, they began to find a rhythm. Jack even managed to make her smile, just barely, when he joked about how her glowing orbs could double as mood lighting for a party. As the night wore on, Jack began to feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. He glanced at the holographic display that showed the damaged ship Lyra had arrived in. It was sleek and menacing, like something out of a sci-fi movie, but it was clear that it was in bad shape. "So," Jack said, breaking the silence, "what happens after you fix this stabilizer? Are you planning to stick around, or is this a hit-and-run kind of thing?" Lyra didn't answer right away. She tapped on the translator, which responded, "Escape. Leave planet." Jack nodded slowly. "Makes sense. You've got people chasing you after all. Probably safer that way." For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in her expression. Regret, maybe, or hesitation. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Jack leaned back against the wall, his gaze drifting to the window. The forest outside was dark and still, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced at Lyra, who was once again fully absorbed in her work. "Hey," he said softly, "we're going to make it through this. I don't know how, but we will." Lyra didn't look at him, but she gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reassure him. As the hum of the alien technology filled the cabin, Jack found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just a few short hours. He had come here looking for peace and quiet, and instead, he'd found himself caught up in an intergalactic chase. It was terrifying, sure, but it was also strangely exhilarating. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt alive. The silent threat. The air inside the cabin buzzed with an electric hum as Jack and Lyra continued their frantic work. Every device, every glowing orb, and every translucent panel seemed to pulse with a sense of urgency. Jack's nerves were frayed, his hands unsteady as he attempted to follow Lyra's intricate gestures. He had never felt so out of his depth. It didn't help that the silence outside the cabin was unnerving. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant howls, and chirping crickets, were absent. It was as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. Jack paused, setting down the alien tool he had been struggling to use. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Lyra looked up from her work, her golden eyes narrowing. She tilted her head, listening. After a moment, she tapped her translator. "Scouts. Near." Jack felt his stomach drop. "Scouts. Like the hunters." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. She gestured to one of the floating panels, which displayed a cluster of glowing dots moving through the forest. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there, and they were getting closer. "Great," Jack muttered, running a hand through his hair. "So not only do I have alien tech in my cabin, but now I've got alien bounty hunters on my doorstep. Fantastic." Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her work, her hands moving faster than ever. Jack could feel the tension radiating off her, and it only made his own anxiety worse. He paced the room, his mind racing. "Okay, we need a plan. What do these scouts want? Are they here for you, or are they just sniffing around?" Lyra tapped her translator. "Tracking. Searching." Jack stopped pacing and looked at her. "Searching for what? Your ship? Your tech?" Lyra hesitated, then pointed to herself. "Of course," Jack said with a bitter laugh. "They're here for you, because why wouldn't they be? And what happens if they find you?" The translator's response was chilling in its simplicity. "Capture. Kill." Jack swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists. Well, that's not happening. Not on my watch. Lyra looked at him, her glowing eyes searching his face. For a moment, Jack thought she might argue, but instead she nodded. The silence outside grew heavier, pressing against the walls of the cabin like an unseen force. Jack moved to the window and peered out, his breath fogging the glass. The forest was dark and still, but he could feel the presence of something out there. Something watching. "We need to fortify this place," he said, turning back to Lyra. "If those scouts get too close, we're going to need more than just a glowing tech lab to keep them out." Lyra tilted her head, considering his words. Then, to Jack's surprise, she gestured for him to follow her. She led him to the corner of the room, where a small box-like device was emitting a soft hum. "What's this?" Jack asked. The translator buzzed. "Defense. Activate perimeter." Jack blinked. "You mean this thing can create some kind of force field or something?" Lyra nodded and began inputting a sequence of commands into the device. Moments later, a low-frequency hum filled the air, and the floating panels displayed a new set of symbols. Outside, faint lines of light began to appear, forming a glowing dome around the cabin. Jack stared in awe. "Okay, that's actually pretty cool. Will it keep them out?" Lyra hesitated, then tapped the translator. "Delay. Not stop." Jack sighed. "Figures. Well, at least it gives us a little breathing room." The glowing dome cast an eerie light over the cabin and the surrounding forest. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the scouts breached their defenses. He turned to Lyra, who was once again absorbed in her work. "Lyra," he said, his voice firm, "we need to talk about what happens if they get in here." She glanced at him, her golden eyes unreadable. "I mean it," Jack continued. "If this place gets overrun, what's the plan? Do you have any weapons? Any way to fight back?" Lyra tapped her translator. "Weapons. Ship. Damage." Jack groaned. "Of course. No weapons, no backup, no escape plan. You really didn't think this through, did you?" Lyra's expression hardened, and Jack immediately regretted his words. "Sorry," he said quickly. "That was uncalled for. I'm scared, okay? This isn't exactly what I signed up for when I came out here." Lyra's gaze softened, and she gave a small nod. She tapped the translator again. "Survive. Together." Jack managed a weak smile. "Yeah, together." Hours passed, the tension growing with each tick of the clock. Jack couldn't bring himself to sit still, pacing the room as Lyra worked tirelessly on the stabilizer. The glowing device in the corner continued to hum, its light growing brighter with each passing minute. Suddenly, a sharp beeping sound filled the cabin. Lyra froze, her head snapping toward the source of the noise. Jack's heart raced as he followed her gaze to one of the floating panels. The glowing dots representing the scouts had stopped moving. They were clustered just outside the perimeter of the dome. "They're here," Jack whispered. Lyra nodded, her expression grim. She tapped her translator. "Prepare." Jack felt a surge of adrenaline as he grabbed the alien tool he had been using earlier. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Let's hope your defenses hold," he said, his voice trembling. Lyra didn't respond. She simply stepped closer to the glowing device in the corner, her hands moving with renewed urgency. Outside, the forest was deathly silent. The scouts were waiting, watching, biding their time. Jack couldn't see them, but he could feel their presence, a cold, creeping sensation that sent shivers down his spine. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. No matter what happened, he wasn't going to let them take Lyra without a fight. The first contact. The air inside the cabin was tense, almost electric. Jack stood by the window, his heart pounding as he stared into the shadowy forest beyond the glowing perimeter. The scouts were out there, waiting, watching. He couldn't see them, but he could feel their presence, like a storm building on the horizon. Lyra worked tirelessly at the stabilizer, her movements fast and precise. The golden light from the device pulsed in rhythm with her efforts, casting eerie patterns across the cabin walls. Jack glanced at her, marveling at her focus. She hadn't flinched when the scouts appeared. If anything, she seemed even more determined to finish her work. Jack tore his gaze away and gripped the alien tool he'd been using earlier. It wasn't much, but it gave him a small sense of control, a fragile hope that he could do something if the scouts broke through. A sudden sound shattered the silence. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, but in the oppressive quiet of the forest, it was enough to make Jack's breath catch. He turned toward the window, his knuckles white, as he tightened his grip on the tool. "They're testing the perimeter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra didn't look up, but her translator chirped softly. "Hold. Short time." Jack frowned. "What do you mean short time? How long until they figure out how to get through?" The translator responded with a single, ominous word. "Minutes." Jack's stomach twisted. Great. No pressure or anything. He turned back to the window, his mind racing. He didn't know what these scouts looked like or what they were capable of, but he knew they weren't here to talk. They were hunters, and Lyra was their prey. The first breach came without warning. A sharp, sizzling sound filled the air, and a section of the glowing dome flickered, then disappeared. Jack's heart leaped into his throat as a shadow darted through the gap, fast and silent. "Lyra," he shouted, gripping the tool like a bat. Lyra spun around, her golden eyes wide. She grabbed a small disc-shaped device from the table and threw it toward the intruder. The disc emitted a high-pitched whine before releasing a burst of energy that sent the shadow flying backward. Jack barely had time to process what had happened before another breach appeared. Two more figures slipped through, their movements unnervingly fluid. Jack raised the tool, his hands shaking. The first figure lunged at him, and Jack swung wildly. The tool connected with a sickening crack, and the figure crumpled to the floor. Jack barely had time to catch his breath before the second figure was on him. This one was faster, dodging his clumsy swings with ease. Jack stumbled backward, his heart pounding as the scout closed in. Suddenly, a blast of light streaked past him, striking the scout square in the chest. Jack turned to see Lyra holding another one of the disc-like devices, her expression fierce. She nodded at him, and he nodded back, a silent understanding passing between them. The battle raged on, the cabin a whirlwind of light and sound. Jack and Lyra fought side by side, their movements clumsy but determined. Jack had never been in a fight like this before, but adrenaline carried him through, his fear giving way to a fierce determination to protect the cabin. And Lyra. Despite their efforts, the scouts kept coming. Each breach in the perimeter brought more of them, their sleek, shadowy forms moving with unnerving precision. Jack could feel his strength waning, his swings growing slower and less effective. "Lyra," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "We can't hold them off much longer." Lyra didn't respond. She was back at the stabilizer, her hands flying over the controls. The golden light from the device was growing brighter, its hum louder and more intense. Jack turned back to the fight, his chest heaving. He knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The scouts were too many, too relentless. Just when it seemed like they were about to be overwhelmed, the stabilizer emitted a deafening chime. The golden light pulsed once, twice, and then expanded outward in a blinding wave. Jack threw up his arms to shield his eyes, his ears ringing from the sound. When he finally lowered his arms, the cabin was silent. The scouts were gone, their shadowy forms disintegrated by the stabilizer's energy. Jack looked around, his chest heaving. What just happened? Lyra stepped away from the stabilizer, her silver skin shimmering in the golden light. She tapped her translator, which responded, "Repelled. Temporary." Jack groaned, sinking to the floor. "Temporary? You mean they're coming back?" Lyra nodded, her expression grave. "Of course they are," Jack muttered, rubbing his temples. Because why would anything be easy? Despite the exhaustion weighing him down, Jack forced himself to stand. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "What's next? How do we make sure they don't come back?" Lyra pointed to the stabilizer, then to a series of floating panels. The translator chirped, "Complete device. Cloak. Escape." Jack frowned. "Cloak? You mean you can hide us? The whole cabin?" Lyra nodded. Jack let out a low whistle. "Okay. That's good. But how long is it going to take?" Lyra hesitated, then tapped the translator. "Hours." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Great. Just enough time for those scouts to regroup and come back with reinforcements." He looked at Lyra, his expression hardening. "We better get to work. The clock is ticking." The cabin was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the silence of anticipation, of knowing that the brief reprieve would soon be over. Jack could feel it in the air, the heavy weight of time slipping away. He glanced at Lyra, who was already back at the stabilizer, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Jack's muscles ached, his hands still trembling from the fight. He had never thought of himself as a fighter, let alone someone who could face down alien hunters. Yet here he was, bruised and battered, but alive. He stood by the window, peering out at the glowing perimeter. The shimmering dome seemed thinner now, its edges flickering faintly. "How much longer do we have before they break through again?" he asked, his voice low. Lyra didn't look up from her work, but the translator buzzed softly. "Uncertain. Scouts regrouping." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Uncertain. Great. Just what I needed to hear." The glowing panels around the room flickered, displaying alien symbols that meant nothing to Jack. He turned back to Lyra, frustration bubbling up inside him. "I need more than that, Lyra. I need to know what we're dealing with. What do they want with you? Why are they hunting you?" Lyra paused, her hands stilling for a moment. She tapped her translator, which replied, "Escape. Information." Jack frowned. "Information? What kind of information?" Lyra hesitated, then gestured to the stabilizer and the floating panels around it. The translator buzzed again. "Technology. Forbidden." Jack's stomach sank. "So you're telling me that this stabilizer, or whatever it is illegal where you come from, and they're chasing you because you have it?" Lyra nodded solemnly. Jack let out a bitter laugh. "Of course. Because it's not enough that I'm stuck in the middle of an alien manhunt. Now I'm harboring a fugitive with stolen tech. Fantastic." Despite his frustration, Jack couldn't bring himself to abandon Lyra. There was something about her, a quiet determination, a vulnerability hidden beneath her otherworldly presence, that made him want to help. He moved to the table where a collection of alien tools and parts was scattered. "All right," he said, picking up a strange, glowing rod. "What can I do to help?" Lyra looked at him, her golden eyes softening. She tapped the translator. "Assist. Recalibrate." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Recalibrate? Sure, no problem. I'll just pretend I know what that means." Lyra sighed. A universal gesture, it seemed, and stepped closer. She demonstrated the motion with her hands, guiding the rod toward one of the glowing panels. Jack watched intently, then mimicked her movements. The panel emitted a soft chime, and Lyra nodded in approval. "Good," the translator buzzed. Jack felt a small surge of pride. "Hey, look at that. I'm officially an alien mechanic." As they worked together, Jack found himself stealing glances at Lyra. Despite the tension and danger, he couldn't help but admire her. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, not just because he was an alien, but because of the way she carried herself. She was resilient, resourceful, and utterly focused on the task at hand. Jack shook his head, forcing himself to focus. This wasn't the time to get distracted. The scouts could return at any moment, and they needed to be ready. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The stabilizer's glow grew brighter, its hum more intense as they worked to complete the repairs. Jack's hands were raw, his muscles screaming in protest. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, Lyra stepped back from the stabilizer, her silver skin shimmering in the golden light. She tapped her translator, which chirped, close, almost ready. Jack leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. Almost ready. How much longer? Lyra gestured to the stabilizer and then to the glowing panels. The translator buzzed. Minutes. Final sequence. Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. Okay, we can hold out for a few more minutes. The piece didn't last. A sudden, sharp sound, like glass shattering, pierced the air. Jack spun toward the window, his heart leaping into his throat. The perimeter was failing, its glowing edges flickering wildly. They're coming, he said, gripping the alien tool like a weapon. Lyra moved to the stabilizer, her hands flying over the controls. Jack positioned himself by the door, his muscles tensing as he braced for the inevitable. The first breach came fast. A shadowy figure darted through the flickering perimeter, its movements fluid and imprecise. Jack swung the tool with all his strength, striking the scout and sending it sprawling. But more were coming. The perimeter continued to falter, and Jack knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Lyra, he shouted, his voice raw. Whatever you're doing, do it faster. Lyra didn't respond. She was completely focused on the stabilizer, her golden eyes glowing with intensity. The cabin became a battlefield, the air filled with the sound of clashing metal and alien energy bursts. Jack fought with everything he had, his body running on pure adrenaline. He didn't know how he was still standing, but he refused to give up. A sudden burst of light filled the room, blinding Jack for a moment. When his vision cleared, he saw Lyra standing by the stabilizer, her hand on a glowing panel. The device emitted a deep, resonant hum, and the golden light expanded outward in a wave. The scouts froze, their shadowy forms disintegrating as the wave passed over them. Jack stumbled backward, his chest heaving as the last of the scouts vanished. The cabin was silent again, save for the steady hum of the stabilizer. Jack looked at Lyra, his heart pounding. Did we win? Lyra tapped her translator, which responded, safe. For now. Jack let out a shaky laugh, sinking to the floor. For now. Right, because nothing about this is ever easy. Lyra stepped closer, her golden eyes meeting his. She extended a hand, and Jack took it, feeling the faint electric buzz of her touch. We did it, he said, his voice soft. We actually did it. Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. Jack knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile calm. The cabin, once alive with the chaos of battle, now settled into a fragile calm. The golden hum of the stabilizer filled the space, a soothing rhythm that seemed to mirror the slowing of Jack's racing heart. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, staring at the faint glow of the remaining perimeter outside. Lyra stood near the stabilizer, her silver skin catching the light as she adjusted the final configurations. She worked tirelessly, her focus unwavering despite the exhaustion that Jack was certain even she must feel. He admired her resolve, though he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders and the occasional falter in her movements. Jack let out a long breath, rubbing his temples. So, what's the plan now? I mean, we survived the first wave, but they're going to come back, right? Lyra turned toward him, her glowing golden eyes meeting his. She tapped her translator, and the robotic voice responded. Safe. Cloak ready. Jack blinked. Wait, it's done. The stabilizer can cloak the cabin now. Lyra nodded, her expression softening just slightly. Jack pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky but determined. Okay, that's good news. Really good news. But what about your ship? Can we get it working? Or is this cloak just buying us more time? Lyra hesitated, then gestured to one of the floating panels. The hologram of her ship flickered into view, still glowing red in several areas. The translator buzzed. Damaged. Flight unsafe. Jack frowned. So, we're stuck here. Lyra nodded, and for the first time, Jack saw a hint of vulnerability in her expression. She tapped the translator again. Repairs possible. Time needed. Jack ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Time. Right. Time we probably don't have, considering those hunters are still out there. The glowing perimeter outside flickered faintly, a reminder that their safety was still tenuous. Jack moved to the window, peering out into the dark forest. He couldn't see or hear anything, but the silence felt oppressive, as though the world itself were holding its breath. He turned back to Lyra. So how does this cloak work? Is it just hiding us, or is it doing something to keep the hunters away? Lyra gestured to the stabilizer, then to the cabin itself. The translator buzzed. Mask. Invisible. Jack raised an eyebrow. Invisible. Like, completely invisible. Lyra nodded. Jack let out a low whistle. Okay, that's actually kind of amazing. But if we're invisible, won't the hunters get suspicious when they can't find the cabin? Lyra tilted her head, then tapped the translator. False trail. Jack blinked. You can create a fake signal. Lead them away from us. Lyra nodded again, and for the first time, Jack felt a surge of genuine relief. All right, he said, pacing the room. That gives us a fighting chance. If we can keep them chasing a ghost, that buys us time to fix your ship. Despite the glimmer of hope, Jack couldn't ignore the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. His body ached, his hands raw from gripping the alien tools during the earlier battle. He sank into his recliner, staring at the ceiling as his mind wandered. I never thought my life would come to this, he muttered. A few days ago, I was just some burned-out tech guy trying to escape the city. Now I'm fighting off alien bounty hunters with a glowing space mechanic in my cabin. Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. She tapped her translator, which buzzed softly. Grateful. Help. Jack sat up, surprised by the words. Grateful. For me. Lyra, you've been doing all the hard work here. I'm just winging it. She tilted her head, studying him for a moment. Then she tapped the translator again. Courage. Unexpected. Jack chuckled, though his face flushed slightly. Well, thanks, I guess. Not sure if courage is the word I'd use, but I'll take it. The hours stretched on as Jack and Lyra continued their preparations. Lyra fine-tuned the stabilizer, ensuring the cloak would hold, while Jack gathered whatever supplies he could find in the cabin. At one point, Jack paused, staring at the glowing perimeter outside. You know, he said, this cabin used to be my safe place. I came here to get away from the chaos of life. Funny how that turned out. Lyra looked at him, her golden eyes softening. She tapped the translator. Safe. Together. Jack smiled faintly. Yeah, together. The bond between them was growing, an unspoken understanding that transcended their differences. Despite the danger and the uncertainty of their situation, Jack felt a strange sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting for something, for someone. As dawn began to break, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, Lyra stepped back from the stabilizer. She tapped her translator, which emitted a single word. Ready. Jack stood, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. It's done. The cloak is up. Lyra nodded, gesturing to the glowing panels. The translator buzzed. Hidden. Secure. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Okay, that's one problem solved. Now we just have to figure out how to fix your ship and get you out of here. Lyra hesitated, then tapped her translator. Danger. Hunters return. Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. Yeah, I figured as much. But we'll deal with it, one step at a time. He looked at her, a determined glint in his eyes. We've made it this far, Lyra. We're not giving up now. Lyra held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Together, they turned toward the task ahead, the weight of their shared mission binding them in a fragile alliance. The final stand. The cabin was cloaked in a deceptive calm, hidden from the hunters by Lyra's stabilizer. The glowing dome outside had vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the forest seem more alive than ever. Jack stood by the window, staring into the endless expanse of trees, his mind racing with possibilities. "How long do you think we have before they figure out the false trail?" he asked, his voice low. Lyra, sitting cross-legged near the stabilizer, didn't look up. Her hands moved quickly over a floating panel, fine-tuning the holographic display of her ship. The translator responded, uncertain. "Delay possible." Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "Right. So we could have minutes or hours, and we're still nowhere near fixing your ship." Lyra glanced at him, her golden eyes filled with a quiet determination. She tapped the translator, which buzzed softly. "Try." "No choice." Jack nodded. "Yeah, no choice. That seems to be the theme of the week." The morning stretched into midday, the cabin filled with the steady hum of alien technology. Jack worked alongside Lyra, his earlier clumsiness giving way to a growing competence. He still didn't understand the mechanics of what they were doing, but he followed Lyra's lead, her calm focus keeping his anxiety at bay. As the hours passed, they made progress. The holographic display of Lyra's ship shifted, the red markers indicating damage slowly fading to yellow. Jack allowed himself a flicker of hope. "So, if we actually pull this off," he said, glancing at Lyra, "what happens next? You just fly away and leave me to clean up the mess." Lyra tilted her head, her expression unreadable. She tapped her translator. "Grateful. Debt." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Debt? Are you saying you owe me?" The translator buzzed again. "Assist. Repay." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, I wouldn't mind a ride in your spaceship. Always wanted to see the stars up close." For a moment, he thought he saw the faintest hint of a smile on Lyra's face, but it was gone before he could be sure. The calm didn't last. A sharp, piercing sound filled the cabin, like a siren echoing from the forest. Lyra froze, her head snapping toward the window. Jack's stomach twisted as he moved to her side. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. Lyra pointed to a floating panel. The holographic display of the forest showed several glowing dots converging on their location. The translator buzzed. "Hunters. Found." Jack's blood ran cold. The false trail didn't hold them off for long, did it? Lyra shook her head, her expression grim. She tapped her translator again. "Prepare. Fight." Jack clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "All right. Let's do this." The first attack came quickly. The hunters didn't bother with stealth this time. The forest erupted with movement as sleek, shadowy forms darted through the trees, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Jack and Lyra stood side by side in the cabin, the faint hum of the stabilizer vibrating beneath their feet. Lyra handed Jack one of the disc-like devices she used before, her golden eyes locking onto his. The translator buzzed. "Throw. Detonate." Jack swallowed hard, gripping the device tightly. "Got it." The first hunter burst through the trees, moving with terrifying speed. Jack hurled the disc, his aim surprisingly accurate. The device exploded on impact, sending the hunter sprawling. "Not bad," Jack muttered, though his heart was pounding. More hunters followed, their sleek forms darting toward the cabin. Lyra moved with fluid precision, her silver skin shimmering as she threw discs and activated energy bursts. Jack did his best to keep up, his fear giving way to a desperate determination. The fight was relentless. The hunters seemed endless, their movements coordinated and precise. Jack's muscles screamed in protest as he swung, threw, and dodged, but he refused to back down. At one point, a hunter broke through their defenses, charging straight for Lyra. Jack reacted instinctively, tackling the creature before it could reach her. The two of them hit the ground hard, and Jack struggled to keep the hunter's razor-sharp claws away from his throat. Lyra moved quickly, disabling the hunter with a well-placed energy burst. She helped Jack to his feet, her expression a mix of gratitude and concern. "You okay?" Jack panted, wiping blood from a shallow cut on his arm. Lyra nodded, her golden eyes scanning him for injuries. As the battle raged on, the hunters began to falter. The stabilizer emitted another powerful wave of energy, disintegrating several of the attackers. The remaining hunters hesitated, their movements less aggressive. "They're falling back," Jack said, his voice hoarse. Lyra nodded, tapping her translator. "Regroup. Return." Jack groaned, leaning against the wall. "Of course. They're like bad movie villains. They always come back." Lyra stepped toward the stabilizer, her hands moving over the controls with renewed urgency. Jack watched her, his chest heaving. "Lyra," he said, his voice soft, "if we don't make it out of this, I just want you to know. I'm glad I stayed. I'm glad I helped." She paused, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she tapped the translator. "Grateful, friend." Jack managed a weak smile. "Yeah, friend." The stabilizer emitted a loud chime, and the holographic display of Lyra's ship turned green. The translator buzzed, "Ship, ready." Jack's heart leaped. "We can go. You can fly us out of here." Lyra nodded, her golden eyes glowing with determination. She grabbed a small device from the table and handed it to Jack. The translator buzzed, "Defend. Hold." Jack understood immediately. She needed him to buy her time to power up the ship. "Go," he said, gripping the device tightly. "I'll hold them off." Lyra hesitated for a moment, then nodded and disappeared through the back door, heading toward her hidden ship. The hunters returned with renewed ferocity, but Jack stood his ground. He fought with everything he had, using the alien devices Lyra had given him to keep the attackers at bay. The cabin shook with the force of the battle, but Jack didn't waver. Just as he thought he couldn't hold out any longer, a deafening roar filled the air. Jack looked up to see Lyra's ship rising above the trees, its sleek form gleaming in the moonlight. A powerful energy wave erupted from the ship, scattering the hunters and leaving the forest eerily silent. Jack stumbled outside, his chest heaving as he watched the ship hover above him. The translator's voice crackled through a device in his hand. "Safe. Come." Jack smiled weakly, relief washing over him. He climbed aboard the ship, leaving the cabin and the chaos behind. As the ship soared into the stars, Jack looked at Lyra, a mixture of awe and gratitude on his face. "So," he said, "what happens now?" Lyra tapped her translator, which buzzed softly. "New journey. Together." Jack grinned, leaning back in his seat. "Yeah, together."